Welcome to Docket Unsealed, where we uncover the cases that continue to raise questions long after the headlines have faded. From unexplained disappearances and shocking murders to investigations filled with hidden details, we examine the evidence, the timeline, and the people at the center of each case. Some stories are difficult to hear, some remain unsolved, and others reveal how a single overlooked detail can change everything. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at one of those cases. So, let's begin. Abduction and torture in real life isn't like the movies. In this case, 27-year-old Lynda Spence was held captive in a room on the Scottish coast. Her kneecaps were smashed, her hands were branded with an iron, and her thumb was chopped off. She wasn't allowed to use a toilet and was forced to remain taped to the same chair while her captors tried to extract money from her. But how did it come to this? After leaving school in Glasgow at 16, Lynda started working in bank call centers. But the money she could earn in ordinary jobs wasn't enough for her. Lynda wanted more. She wanted a glamorous lifestyle, so she decided to set up her own business using money from the sale of her grandmother's bungalow as capital. Lynda presented herself as a financial advisor, but she was a compulsive liar, according to people who knew her. She started by making relatively small amounts of money by telling people who struggled to get mortgages that she could help them secure one, which she did by falsifying bank statements and other documents. From there, she expanded into larger schemes. Her confidence allowed her to make money, but she was also constantly taking money from people to maintain her lifestyle. In December 2008, she was declared bankrupt. Even then, she continued living the high life, with a taste for fast cars and champagne. In 2009, after bankruptcy, Lynda established a new company specializing in mortgages and lettings called Fraser Properties in Glasgow. As she moved into larger deals, she began dealing with increasingly dangerous people from the criminal underworld, including two feared Glasgow criminals, Colin Coates and his accomplice, Philip Wade. Coates in particular was known as a frightening and extremely violent figure. Lynda sold Colin an opportunity to invest in a multi-million-pound land deal near Stansted Airport in Essex. The deal involved a fictitious man invented by Lynda, whom she called Uncle Ben after the rice brand. Colin gave Lynda £85,000, all the money he had, which had been set aside as his parents' funeral fund. He gave it to her on the promise that she could turn it into £3.2 million. The money was paid in Danish bearer bonds, which were supposedly intended to avoid the need to pay VAT. For more than a year, Lynda kept Colin waiting, but he wasn't a foolish man, and eventually he began to suspect that something was seriously wrong with the deal. He wasn't the only victim. Lynda also managed to scam at least one other property developer out of a six-figure sum using the same fictional deal. She frequently used aliases and, during this period, had at least 20 different mobile phones. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, but instead of dealing with the pressure from angry investors who wanted their money back, Lynda continued working on new scams. On the 14th of April 2011, Lynda and her mother spoke on the phone as they did every day. They were very close. Lynda turned down an invitation to lunch, saying that she was traveling to London for a series of meetings. But she wasn't in London. She had actually been abducted by Colin Coates and Philip Wade. They forced her into a car on Broomhill Path in central Glasgow and drove her approximately 30 miles west to the West Kilbride coast in North Ayrshire, where a friend of theirs, petty criminal David Parker, had a flat in Meadyfoot Road. Even though Lynda must have known she was in serious trouble, she could not have anticipated the horror that followed. Later that day, her mother reported her missing and made tearful appeals for information. Lynda was still alive at that point and is believed to have remained alive for 13 days while being subjected to horrific torture. Coates and Wade visited her every day and inflicted further injuries. Her kneecaps were smashed, her hands were branded with an iron, her thumb was chopped off, she was beaten with a golf club, and her little finger was severed. She wasn't allowed to use a toilet and was forced to remain taped to a chair while her captors tried to recover their money. Meanwhile, outside in West Kilbride, spring was arriving and everyday life continued as normal. Local newspapers reported ordinary community stories while, inside the flat, Lynda continued to suffer. During the torture, Coates obtained enough information from Lynda to realize that she had been giving some of his money to another property developer, John Glenn, who had also been threatening Lynda after being scammed out of almost £200,000 in profits. Coates believed that Glenn might be able to repay some of the money he was owed. On the 20th of April, Coates visited Glenn. To demonstrate that he was serious, Coates brought a plastic bag containing Lynda's severed thumb. Glenn quickly understood that his own life could be in danger if he didn't cooperate, and he gave Coates money with the promise of more to come. On that same day, a week after Lynda's abduction, her father Jim received one final phone call from his daughter. She claimed she was in London before the phone call suddenly ended. It would be the last time anyone heard from Lynda. Detective Superintendent Talent Buchanan led the investigation into Lynda's disappearance, but the case presented enormous challenges. Many of the people Lynda had become involved with were unwilling to speak to police, and their paper trails were either non-existent or extremely difficult to understand. Coates might have escaped justice, but he was greedy. He returned to John Glenn and tried to obtain even more money. 4 months after Lynda's abduction, on the 15th of August 2011, he took the intimidation even further by forcing Glenn to strip naked in an attempt to extort more money from him. Glenn managed to remain calm during the encounter, but he was terrified that he would become Coates's next victim. The following day, he went to police and told them everything he knew. David Parker eventually admitted his involvement in the plot, but claimed that he and his friend Paul Smith, who was also at the flat, were too frightened of Coates to let Lynda go. Smith told investigators that Parker had been shocked and frightened when he saw Lynda's condition. Meanwhile, a friend of Wade told detectives that Wade had confessed to helping dispose of a body at the flat where Lynda had been held and directed police there. There was no sign of Lynda at the flat, but despite Coates carrying out an extensive cleaning operation, investigators discovered his fingerprint inside. A member of the police team also noticed unusual nails used in the newly installed floorboards. The boards were lifted, and investigators found tiny blood specks that were later identified as Lynda's blood. This placed both Coates and Lynda at the flat. Detectives now believed they had enough evidence to proceed to trial, but they still didn't know where Lynda was. They were almost certain that she was dead, but nobody was telling them where her body had been taken. Detectives believed that after killing Lynda, Coates and Wade had cut up her body and disposed of the remains so thoroughly that she could never be found. Coates and Wade faced murder charges. At trial, Coates attempted to portray himself as anything but an abductor. He claimed that he had provided a safe house for Lynda so that she could escape from the people who were chasing her. He even claimed that he had lent her his laptop and DVDs to keep her occupied. According to his account, the flat was simply a small cannabis farm, and he claimed he had no idea where Lynda had gone. He described the allegations against him as monstrous lies. The court heard that when Lynda was first taken by Coates and Wade, she didn't initially understand what was happening. It was only after she was taken inside the flat that Coates told her exactly what was happening, saying, "Lynda, this is an abduction." David Parker, who rented the flat, later gave a terrifying account of Lynda's condition, saying that he knew she was badly injured but didn't want to know how badly. He described her as being in an extremely frightened state. Paul Smith told the court that he was paid to keep an eye on Lynda in the flat. He said he gave her cups of tea and soup, but he never allowed her to leave the chair, not even to use the toilet. The jury then spent around 20 hours over 5 days considering the evidence following the 11-week trial. Coates and Wade were both found guilty of murdering Lynda and disposing of her body. Coates was ordered to serve a minimum of 33 years in prison, while Wade received a minimum term of 30 years. Parker and Smith were each sentenced to 11 years for assaulting Lynda and holding her captive. There was no celebration in the courtroom when the verdicts were delivered. Coates and Wade sat in the dock with their heads down and said nothing as they were led back to their cells. The public gallery was silent. The judge made clear that Coates had been the prime mover behind the plot and described him as manipulative, devious, cruel, ruthless, and extremely dangerous. The judge told both men that they had been convicted of a truly monstrous and barbaric crime, and described Wade as a violent and dangerous man with no respect for human life or civilized society. Following the convictions, Lynda's parents, Jim and Patricia, released a statement expressing their devastation over her murder. They said that no verdict could bring their daughter back or spare her the terrible ordeal that had taken her life. They described Lynda as a warm, kind, and thoughtful daughter who always had time for others, and said that they missed her enormously. The case remains especially painful because Lynda's parents were never given the location of her remains. Despite repeated appeals, Coates and Wade had not provided the information needed to bring Lynda home. The fact that her family never had the opportunity to recover her body added another layer of suffering to an already devastating case. The case also raises difficult questions about the actions of the other two men involved. Although they later claimed that they were too frightened of Coates to help Lynda, the reality is that they were still faced with choices. They could have sought help, reported what was happening, or tried to intervene, but they did nothing to stop the suffering. And that brings us to the end of this case here on Docket Unsealed. The evidence may have provided answers, but the story also leaves behind questions that can stay with us long after the investigation is over. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to follow the case with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the smallest detail can reveal the biggest truth. This is Docket Unsealed.